You are the most important person in the world, in the whole room. You are so important because the power of communication rests on your shoulders. You came here today to listen to these wonderful speakers, and by doing so, became the most important people in the room. Now, there will be some who may watch this later on YouTube who will say, hey, I'm the most important person in the room too. And they'd be right, because at the end of the day, we're all the most important people to ourselves, right? But you folks who are here today are not only the most important people, but also the most powerful, because there is a special power in public listening. Now, as an educator for over 25 years in the college environment, I have to tell you that I have experienced a great deal of pressure to put my classes into an online format in order to reach more students. In fact, just the other day, my department chair here in communication at UCDavis said to me, Alisa, you know what you should do? You should put your lectures on video. The thinking is that video is so much more convenient. Students can listen to a lecture whenever they want, wherever they want, however they want, as many times as they want. I don't know how often that happens. But there's no worry about traveling to and from a lecture, or even how many students can fit in a lecture hall. The possibilities are great, they say. And to a certain extent, they're right. Online educational videos can be great things. If you want to learn how to cook an egg and there's no one around to teach you, you just go to YouTube, you get a video, you watch that video, you can watch it as many times as you want. You can even pause it while you practice along with it. I guarantee you, you'll learn how to cook that egg. And online classes can be good too, especially for motivated students. There are plenty of examples of motivated students who have succeeded in online classes. But when educators and administrators start treating lectures as nothing more than information products, and then measure the effectiveness of these information products by how many people these products can be delivered to, and then come to the logical conclusion that the best way to reach so many people is by putting lectures on video, online, then a huge part of the spirit and effectiveness of education is lost. In-person listening is on the decline in our society. And I fear that as we move away from in-person listening, from live public speaking with live public listeners, that we will lose a great power of listening and much of the purpose of higher education along with it. Now, speaking of fear, some people have suggested that perhaps my aversion to putting my lectures on video is nothing more than a fear of technology or a fear of change. And I'll admit, technology is pretty scary. I positively freak out every time there's a new iTunes update. Maybe you do too. But I assure you I'm not afraid of change, unless of course it's change for the worse. But just to make sure that I'm coming to you from a place of honesty and not a position of fear, I did some self-examination, and I discovered I do in fact have a few fears. Fortunately, most of them can be checked off, but I thought I'd share some of these fears with you. My first fear about putting my lectures on video is that I would look bad on video. Maybe some of you can relate. They say the scariest thing a person can do is give a public speech. I think the scariest thing a person can do is watch themselves give a public speech. Yeah. But then I realized that actually you don't look any worse on video than you do in person. So as long as I don't actually watch my video, I should be fine. I could check that fear off. My second fear was that it would be too much work. But then I realized that I could just have someone video my lecture and post it online. I could get a young person to do that for me. That'd be easy. Check it off. My third fear was that I might say something inappropriate, and that could happen. Goodness knows I've probably said a few inappropriate things from time to time in class. But actually, that's where the beauty of putting lectures on video comes in, editing. I could edit out anything appropriate, edit in anything I wanted. Heck, I could make the most perfect lecture ever. So I checked that fear off. My fourth fear was that students wouldn't be able to ask questions. And this one was a little harder to get around. In a lot of lectures, students don't ask that many questions, and that's what office hours are for, or chat rooms, or maybe, again, that perfect lecture no one would have any questions about. So I checked that fear off as well. My fifth and final fear was that I wouldn't be there in person to see if people were really listening. And this one is true. I couldn't check that fear off. Listeners really are less motivated to listen to a lecture on video. Listeners will pay less attention, and they'll be less involved and be less inspired by watching this video as well. How do I know? Well, it's well documented that the presence of a live speaker makes a message more real, more powerful, and more immediate. This is something that's known as the immediacy effect. And no, there won't be a pop quiz on this later, but you might want to remember the immediacy effect because it has a big effect on us. Think of how you respond when you get junk mail. What do? You just delete it, right? Or you toss it out. What happens if you get an unsolicited phone call? You probably just hang up. But what happens if a person comes to your front door? If you actually open the door, chances are you're going to engage with that person, at least for a little while. The presence of a live person increases our social awareness, and it triggers our natural human need to respond. We see that a person is giving us their time and their energy and their effort, and we tend to want to reciprocate. And this reciprocation creates a connection between the other person. This connection not only makes us connect to the person, but it actually also increases our interest in the message that that person is sending to us. And this connection is why all live communication is always interactive, while recorded communications are not. So let me tell you about the power of public speaking with public listeners. The first power of public listening is feedback. And feedback is the nonverbal messages that listeners give while the speaker is speaking. Nonverbal expressions are things like facial expressions, nodding, leaning forward. I can see some of you are actually doing that. Some of you are nodding and smiling, and I can even hear some sounds. And this feedback lets the speaker know how the message is being received. I like to think of feedback as being like a kind of a dance between the speaker and the listeners. I think of the dance as being an Argentine tango because I'm an Argentine tango dancer. And one of the things I love about Argentine tango is that there's a leader and a follower. And when I dance tango, I'm the follower. So in tango, the leader's job is to propose a movement. Just like in communication, it's the speaker's job to propose a message. In tango, it's the follower's job to receive that movement and respond to that movement. Just like in communication, it's the listener's job to receive the message and respond to the message. In tango, leaders and followers together create a dance, and speakers and listeners together create a communication. The effect of feedback is to actually empower the speaker. It makes the speaker realize that the speaker can actually get that message across, and it gives the speaker confidence. Now, the second power of live public listening comes from the speaker's responses to the listener's feedback. In face-to-face listening, listeners receive responses from the speaker. So these responses can take many forms. One form is that the speaker looks at you. When a speaker's looking at you, you realize you're being noticed. you realize that your presence is important, and you realize that you matter. Having the speaker's eyes on you puts social pressure on listeners that actually improves their listening because it increases motivation. The same way you're motivated to work out just a little harder at the gym when you know people are watching. Yeah. Another way that speakers respond to listeners is they respond non-verbally. Speakers give nods and smiles and otherwise show listeners that their feedback matters. This gives listeners rewards. It makes you realize when you're listening that you are important and that your feedback is actually appreciated. Whenever I'm dancing a tango and the leader makes a movement and then I respond by doing my step, I can always tell that it makes the leader happy. And this makes me feel good too, makes me feel satisfied, like I know I'm doing my job. Another way that speakers can respond to listeners is by actually adapting their message to the listener's feedback. Speaker might look around and see confused looks and offer up more explanation. Or if a speaker notices some laughter, the speaker might offer up more jokes. Or if the speaker looks around and sees a lot of boredom, the speaker might thankfully change the topic. In this way, listeners come to realize how very important they are. Listeners are so important that the listeners can actually shape the direction of the message. So the effect of all these speaker responses to feedback is that it empowers listeners, makes listeners understand how truly important they are in the communication experience. And the third power of live public listening comes from other listeners' responses. In public listening, we can hear and see other people's responses, and this helps us in a couple of ways. One way is that it helps us validate our understanding of the message. When you look around or you listen and you realize other people are responding to a message in a similar way to you, this increases your confidence that you are understanding the message in an appropriate way. You know, if everybody's laughing, chances are the message is funny. But another way that other listeners' responses help us is if the listeners' responses don't actually match up with our own response. Let's say I'm listening to a speaker and I feel offended. But I look around and I see that other people are relaxed. They seem to be enjoying themselves. They're having a different response than I am. I may still feel offended, but I will at least have an understanding that there are other possible interpretations of that message. And having that understanding will deepen my own understanding of the message. So the effect of other listeners' responses is to actually empower the message. It increases the likelihood that the message is understood. And another thing happens when we listen in public. When we laugh together, or we feel joy together, or wonderment, amazement, or even confusion, these shared experiences create a bond. And that bond begins to establish a sense of common trust. We begin to trust each other a little bit because not only have we shared an experience, but we've relied on each other a little bit to understand that experience. At a tango dance, everybody listens to the same music and they're dancing the same dance. And there's a sense of togetherness and a sense of community. People feel good about that. They'll leave the dance and they hug and they kiss on both cheeks. And I'm not saying we're all going to hug and kiss after a lecture, but the similar experience of shared community can actually make us feel more enthusiastic and more satisfied about our listening experience. So we've seen how public listening can empower the speaker, empower the listeners, and empower the message, and even make us feel good. A friend of mine told me a story about a time that she was a student listening to a lecture, and she found herself in the overflow room. How many of you know about the overflow room? For those of you who don't know, it's what they do when they book too many students into a lecture hall. And they'll put a camera and run a live feed to a remote location. And the remote location is the overflow room. So as my friend tells the story, the students in the overflow room are kicking back, they're having a great time, they've got their feet up, they've got their notes in their lap, it's all good. And at some point, the professor says something, all the students in the overflow room start laughing. But they see that the students in the lecture hall are not laughing. They're taking the professor seriously and actually writing things in their notes. What had happened was the professor had not intended to be funny. And the students who were in the lecture hall realized this because they were paying attention to both the speaker and the message. But the students who were in the overflow room, they did not have the advantage of the immediacy effect. So they were not paying as close attention, and they misunderstood the message. Unfortunately, the professor was not able to see the feedback of the students in the overflow room, so he never knew that his message was partially misunderstood. At least my friend had the responses of the other listeners to help inform her. Had she been alone at home watching the lecture on video, she never would have known that she had misunderstood. Part of what we go to a lecture for is information, of course, and we hope to get the right information. But part of what we go to a lecture for is to be inspired. It's to be part of the conversation, and even to contribute to the human legacy of transmitting information to one another. We can all go to the internet and pretty much find any information we want. But a large part of the purpose of higher education is to teach us how to respond to that information. And this is what public listening can do for us. Public listening can teach us the importance of responding to information. And it can show us appropriate ways to respond. And possibly best of all, it can demonstrate the power that we have when we do effectively respond. So I encourage all of you, use your power. Take advantage of every opportunity you have to engage in live, in-person listening. And take this moment right now to congratulate yourselves for being here and doing just that, for engaging in public listening. And for those of you who may watch this later on YouTube, well, I just have to say, I appreciate you too. I just wish you were here. Thank you all for listening.